Due to the graphic nature of this program, viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Marco Dre Show, everybody. It is Wednesday, August 27th. Thanks again for tuning in to get all the relevant, groundbreaking news here in the United States, around the world. The only show where the facts are facts and hard truths always thrive. Please be sure to hit that like button, follow the show, hit that notification tab, and share with as many people as possible. That way you can get the truth out to everybody. Let's get ready for the best hour radio has to offer, uncensored and ready to go. You know, I was going to start off my show kind of talking a little bit about what I was discussing yesterday about slavery in America and kind of going through the history of it so everyone is aware of the truth of what happened. But then I wake up this morning and I see this awful situation that happened in Minneapolis. There were two children that were killed at this Annunciation Catholic school, 8 and 10-year-olds. 4 children were in critical condition this morning, according to the chief of emergency. This is an awful situation again, where we have some type of deranged lunatic going out there committing an awful act on children inside a school building. We've seen this time and time again. While I could sit here and talk about who this killer was, who they're saying this is. Again, I don't know who this is. I don't care who it is. But we have to ask ourselves one thing. What's being done about this violence at schools? You ever notice that? We've had Sandy Hook, going back to 2012, I believe. You have Parkland, you have Columbine, you have all these different instances, year after year, right? We had that awful shooting in Tennessee, of which I had many questions about. They were never answered, of course. But they happen time and time again. We're told the shooter is this raving lunatic. They've got a manifesto. They don't like Donald Trump. And then, they talk about gun control, and then that's it. That's it. Nothing happens. Nothing is done. Not on a local level, not on a state level, not on a federal level. So, while I could talk about who this killer is, what his manifesto was, I guess he went on an 11-minute rant, they're saying, on YouTube about what he's going to do. He has all these markings all over the gun. Ridiculous nonsense like this. And nobody knows about it, apparently. Nobody knows this guy is a raving lunatic. Now, they're asserting that he had 2 names. He's a tranny, apparently. That's what they're trying to say now. Here's the situation. If we want this type of violence to stop in our schools, what should be the response to something like this across the nation? Not just in our major cities, but across the nation. What should our response be? What would you do if you're a parent sending your kid to a public school, a private school, a Catholic school, Christian school, Jewish school, secular school, wherever, it doesn't matter, and you want to be ensured that their safety is top-notch at this school? What would you expect to be done? I've said this before. I'll say it again to you today. We need to have armed security on our school campuses. Armed security. Not some little training. I mean, I want armed, trained security at every site where there are children. Not just one guy. I want several people inside the building. I want the premises secured. We're not told anything now how this guy even got into the school. They said he was shooting in the parking lot first, and then he barricaded himself behind a door. Then he committed suicide. They all commit suicide. You ever notice that too? We're not told anything about their past, if they're on any psychotropic drugs, anything like this. we need to protect our kids in schools. And the only way you can do that in a gun-free zone, I'm sorry to say, you have to start bringing in armed, trained security onto these campuses. When you have somebody who is, again, deranged, homicidal, a lunatic, a fringe maniac, they're going to go try to pick off easy targets. Now, maybe this pathetic waste of life had a something against the Catholic Church. I don't know. I'm speculating. But the idea that we sit here and go, man, that's awful. I can't believe this is happening. They're just kids. Well, no kidding. First of all, a life is a life. It's awful when its children have to witness this, of course. But this should not be happening. But we keep seeing it and nothing gets done about this. So I'm asking you, the listener, is it time that we finally secure our public schools with armed, trained security? I mean armed, ready to go. They are ready to act. They can deter somebody trying to come into the building and do harm to everybody. And would that alone, knowing that, if that were the case, would that deter a lot of these lunatics from entering in our schools and killing children? You know, we saw what happened in Uvalde, where the school wasn't even secured. The door was left open because I guess the lock had been broken on it, or something along that line. So someone is able just to walk right in that school. You know, it's not 1950 anymore, folks. We're living in a time where we have, obviously, this type of behavior. The whole mental illness thing going on, you know, or what have you with the trans community. And yes, it is a mental illness. It's not mean to say that. It is a mental illness. And you sit here and glorify somebody for that and cheer them on when they're seriously going through lots of problems. And we're shocked when some of these people act up in society. What should be done, and again, if you want to start decreasing crime, open up the mental hospitals back up in the States. Right, remember we used to have those? We used to have them in California. Until good old Pat Brown closed them down. They eventually closed down under Reagan. Of course, he got the negative feedback for that, of course. But it was Pat Brown that put that into works. Close the mental hospitals. What happened? Well, we start seeing homelessness. You start seeing drug use rampantly in the 1960s when this was happening. And it just gets worse over time. It exacerbates. Same situations going on now with these types of violent acts that occur. It could be on a New York City subway. It could be in a public school. It could be inside a grocery store. It doesn't matter. When you have people on the streets that are mentally ill, or you have people acting like this. Now, if someone, God honest, believes they're the opposite sex, something's wrong. And the idea that you're just going to pat somebody on the back and say, well, you know, that's great. You are definitely that. When they're clearly going through something very traumatic in their mind. And they're making up delusions, clearly, that they believe they're the opposite sex. That's a big problem, isn't it? So yes, we should offer help to people that have mental illnesses, not encourage it. That's number one. Number two, we need to secure our schools. Armed security. That's what we need. It can be done, and it should be done. If that building is open for school events, what have you, doesn't matter what it is. If the school building is open, you need to have armed security on the campus. You will see a drop in all this, and this nonsense will not be on the news anymore. Because it's simply not going to fly. The third thing that's very important here. Very, very important. I've asked you this before. Where do we get our morality from in this country? Where does our morality come from? It comes from God, clearly. And when you have a nation that is moving away from their belief in God Almighty, they stop going to church, they start preaching, secular values to their kids. Anything goes. If it feels good, do it. Who cares what anybody thinks? And I'm not saying you should just care what everybody thinks in that regard. But if you're doing something that's deviating from society, that's not normal behavior, you probably shouldn't be doing that. Right? You know what I'm saying? That's just common sense, I think. But time and time again, we see that the attendance in churches dropped significantly over the years. And what has been the end result of this? You took God out of the classroom in the 1960s in prayer. And now look what we have here. We have children praying in the first week of school, of all things. And 2 children are shot dead. 4 in critical condition. 17 are injured overall. We need to return back to belief in God, folks, in this country. And we're clearly seeing, I mean, you can look at it, as we deviate away from that, we see lots more chaos in our streets. The way people act, the way people respond to other people, the lack of respect other people have for other people. This nation was formed as a Christian nation. That is absolutely correct. Christian values. That's what it was founded on. And how we've moved away from that. Look where we are today. Look at what we see. Look what we accept in our streets. The decadence, the chaos, the violence, the depravity. We have homeless people in the streets, defecating on the streets. Just go to San Francisco. Look at the crap map that they had to put up there because there's so much fecal matter in the city itself. It's disgusting. It's disgraceful. It's inhumane in many regards. For one, for people to have to go through with that, but the other aspect is you have people doing it and nothing's being done about it. We have to get back to our basics in this country. Otherwise, we're going to lose our nation. Kids should not fear having to go to school. We shouldn't have to have, news articles like this. Right now, they're just honed in on this so-called killer. Again, I don't know who killed these people. I rarely trust any of these stupid narratives now when I see some of these things. They've got a manifesto. The shooter always kills themselves. I question these things, folks. That's just me. Now, this creep could have very well done this. I don't know. Doesn't really matter to me. But look at the narrative they're setting now. He's an alt-right, anti-Trump guy. Look, it's Trump's fault. That's what the Democrats ran to. It's Donald Trump's fault. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. You can't make this stuff up. Now, the mayor of Minneapolis, for the time being, unless he gets reelected, we have Omar Fata. We'll have Jacob Fry just for a little bit longer now. But this is what he had to say regarding this.
These were Minneapolis families. These were American families. And the amount of pain that they are suffering right now is extraordinary. And don't just say this is about thoughts and prayers right now. These kids were literally praying. It was the first week of school. They were in a church.
Shouldn't happen. Shouldn't happen. I mean, that's the answer to that question. It should not be happening. We should be demanding better of our local officials. We should be, again, encouraging law enforcement on campus or some type of armed security on these campuses to protect these children and the staff and such that works there and the people that come on the campus. There were also people attending the mass that was happening, by the way. I believe 3 adults were hit as well. The way we stop this is, again, mental institutions, absolutely. Armed security on these campuses, absolutely, 100%. In fact, it might be worthwhile to do that on our college campuses. Maybe we don't have the street thugs coming in and wreaking havoc all across the campus that don't even attend the college. What, you think those are UCLA students that are destroying and defacing the campus, leaving trash everywhere? Come on. Give me a break, folks. I know you'd like to think that, but give me a break. This has got to stop. This has to stop. This shouldn't happen. And the response to this should be, we're not letting this happen again. We are going to have armed security. We're going to open up our mental institutions, mental hospitals, whatever you want to call them. I don't give a damn. And people with these severe mental illnesses need to have the right proper treatment. They should not be in society. That's the right answer to this. Now, the left right away hit gun control. We got to get these guns off the streets, these assault rifle bans. Oh, that's their answer to everything. That's their answer to everything. Now, I want to remind our friends on the left that criminals do not follow the law, by and large. I mean, clearly he wanted a gun-free zone with a firearm. That's breaking the law. Breaking and entering, that's another law that he broke, he violated. Shooting people, that's a crime. Killing people, absolutely, that's a crime. Criminals do not give a damn what the law is. They are criminals. This guy was a criminal. That's just what he is. They don't follow the law. And the only thing to deter someone coming at you with that type of lethal force is to meet that person with equal or greater lethal force. That's it. That's the end of it. That's over. That's the only thing you could say about this. And I mean, we could say we pray for these families, of course, that are dealing with such a awful tragedy. A couple days into the school year? Parents that have dead children. It's awful to hear these things. Absolutely awful. Now, this will go on for a couple days, then we won't hear about it ever again. Just like we never heard anything about that Tennessee shooting. We're told it was a tranny, goes by the name Aiden or some nonsense like that. We had no answers to this. It just goes away, and then it happens again. They say the same thing. It's just a revolving circle. Nothing changes. Well, it's time to change things. That way these instances do not happen in the future. All right, folks. So, awful to start our show off this way, but I wanted to go over this with you. I wanted to share my ideas about this. And finally, as I said, the return to morality, the return to Christian values. Start taking your kids to church. Bring your kids some type of normalcy. I'm not saying people that are secular are bad. I'm not saying that all, but they need an understanding of what Christian values are. Because that's how our society was supposed to have functioned. And again, we see ourselves slipping time after time in these awful situations, unfortunately. All right, moving on. Let me go over my next article that I wanted to go over. I told you yesterday I went to the Reagan Library with a friend of mine. And we got into talking about the big switch myth that took place. And it was the idea that there was, obviously, we have two major political parties in America. They switched in the 1960s, of course. The Dems stopped being racist all of a sudden. And they became the righteous and moral party. And the Republicans became the new beneficiaries of this newfound racism in their party, apparently, even though the party was founded as an abolitionist party. Interesting stuff. Now, keep in mind, racism in and of itself is just an idea in somebody's head of superiority. All right, that's all it is. It's just another ism word that's been created, of course. Now, whereas the big problem is discrimination. That's what we should all be focusing on. Whereas discrimination is the actual distinction of treating others differently and oftentimes with force. Right? For example, let's think about, I don't know, this race cannot enter this store ever. You're banned. You can't come in. That's discrimination. This religion can only earn half of what the other religion is earning in this country. That's discrimination. This group has this ability to be favored in college admissions, but, this other group has to go through tougher parameters. That's discrimination. So the idea that the 1960s civil rights movement was apparently this big awakening for the Democratic Party, apparently. And the parties were so-called flipped. Now, that is a bunch of nonsense, so anyone that's thinking about that has to realize this is a bunch of nonsense. Let's take the black vote, for example. The concept, of course, that blacks went over to the left during this big revelation in the 1960s. during the civil rights movement. This is false in and of itself. We know that in 1932, we had President Herbert Hoover, who received actually a plurality of the black vote, somewhere around 2/3 of it. Now, fast forward just 4 years later, in the 1936 election, FDR receives roughly 70% of the black vote. And again, this was due to the New Deal arrangements that were taking place. These new programs that FDR was putting into place, giving, certain types of subsidies, certain types of food welfare systems, all that kind of stuff. Now, as far as I can recall, the Dems, largely in the South, were the majority of these, the states, right? They controlled the states. They also were in charge of the KKK. They were the party of lynchings. And then, of course, they were the party of segregation. That was still a thing at the time in the 1960s. So, in other words, this switch happened due to the economics of the Great Depression. It had nothing to do with civil rights. And by the way, this upset many blacks, too, to leave the Republican Party and go over to the left, where it was, again, still predominantly very, I guess if you want to call, discriminatory. Absolutely. As I said, lynching, segregation, this was all happening in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. All that was still very relevant at the time. And today, they still vote predominantly for the Democratic Party. So, the idea that the switch took place for black voters was, again, not a result of the civil rights movement. It wasn't a part of this phenomenon of the 1960s. It happened at least 30 years prior to all this. So they had been in the Democratic Party this entire time. There was no big revelation. There was no switch. The switch happened far, far earlier than this. So it's important to understand that as well. So then you have to ask yourself, okay, the civil rights movement, this big switch in the 1960s, they say happened, clearly didn't happen for the black vote at least. Okay. So did the Southern Dixiecrat wing of the Democratic Party just go out and become Republicans? Well, the answer to that, too, is no. Now, of the several hundred of them, they were all in these levels of government, local, federal, state government, what have you. Only 2 became Republicans in the 1960s. The most notable, of course, was Strom Thurmond, who was a senator from the state of South Carolina, and Albert Watson in the House, also from South Carolina, who was mentored by Strom Thurmond himself. So we have 2 people of several hundred claiming to be a part of this Dixiecrat party wing. So think of it just as a wing of the Democratic Party. 2 became Republicans. That's it. In government, as an entirety. That's it. They're the only 2 that switched parties in the 1960s. Everyone else stayed a Democrat, lived as a Democrat, and they died as a Democrat. There was no switching for these people. They stayed in that party. So that's another point that really negates this switch theory. And by the way, hell of a switch, right? We have 2 people switching over. One person I do want to talk about, too, though, is George Wallace, governor of Alabama. He was the guy that said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He was that guy. Ran in the 1968 election. Ended up getting shot, by the way, and paralyzed for the rest of his life a little while after that. But one thing that's interesting about him, he was a Democrat his entire life, but he later recanted his previous positions on segregation, a lot of these racial issues. So I think it's important to say that, yes, there are certain people that can change, but the party itself did not switch over to Republicans or Democrats or vice versa. Many of these people just simply stayed in their designated party. Some other points that are really interesting about this, too. We can go back in history, and we can look at things like the 13th Amendment, where we have every Republican voting to abolish slavery, and only 2 Democratic senators and 14 congressmen voted for it. Whereas we have, we have 5 senators We have 50 congressmen saying no. They're not going to vote for it. So we see the contrast in all this, right? We have 0 Democrats voting for the 14th Amendment. That would be the citizenship of slaves, equal protection under the law. 0 Democrats voted for this law. 100% of Republicans voted for this back in the 1860s. So there was no switch then. After the Civil War, there was no switch then. There was no switch again in the 1960s, almost 100 years later. So these things simply did not happen. So where they're pulling this information, I have no idea. I'm sure I have no idea. But it's really just nothing more than a bunch of propaganda. So then finally you have to ask yourself, though, this. They say, why did the South switch from Democrat to Republican today? Times have changed since the 1960s, where the South was, again, predominantly Democrat. And this is how they try to play this off. Oh, look, see, the South is really red, so he's Republican. Now, it's because of this. Those Democrats, those racists, they just became Republicans. And that's why it is like that today. Not true. Not true. This idea of starting to vote for the Republican Party began in the 1980s with President Ronald Reagan, whose library I was at yesterday. Fantastic, by the way. I encourage everybody who can, please get out to Simi Valley and go see it. It'll give you a breath of fresh air and normalcy. You'll love it. Why did it happen, though, with Reagan? What was changing in the South? What was changing with the Democratic Party? What did Reagan stand for? Reagan is standing for things like patriotism, respect for the military, of course, the belief in God and religion, you choosing your own destiny, pro-life, anti-communism, lower taxation, free market, all these values. Those in the South, the conservative, democratic South, began to stay with. Okay, but the idea is the Democrat Party itself, after this, begins to start going much, much further to the left. So the Republican Party really hasn't switched that much, I wouldn't say. I mean, I view Donald Trump today as a populist, really. I don't believe that he's a conservative, although he does believe in some conservative values. But the party itself hasn't really gone anywhere. It's pretty much the same party. It always has been. But it now advocates for the working man, whereas in the past that wasn't always really the case. It wasn't really a party platform, if you will. That was the Democrats' platform, actually. The working man. They say it today, too. They say it all the time. We're for the little guy. We're for the working man. You heard the DNC guy yesterday on the show, Ken Martin, saying, we got to go and we've got to make sure we get the every American back in our party. And he's referring to the little man. The guy that gets up and works his ass off all day. But they haven't become that. They've been the party of big money, dark money, billionaires. And they know this. And that's not appealing to people who are trying to make it in this country. So we see these things. We see that the party goes more to the left. The obsession with abortion, of course, birth control and all this. The LGBTQ, XYZ, WTUV group stuff. Way left on that one. Of course, look who's ushering in transgenderism today, which is a bunch of nonsense, both in reality and biologically. It simply does not make any sense. But also, we have this shift. Think about this, too. We've got this shift away from, being more predominantly agrarian in the South. And now today it's much more industrialized. And you see that, again, that shift away from some of these previous positions that were once had. And again, I'm not saying rural America is racist. But what I am saying is that in the South, as it became less agrarian, and as it became more developed, this discrimination factor that was once there largely dropped. And that's why you're seeing the South become much more developed today. That's why you're seeing a lot of these things change. Was it because people changed the parties? Was it because of this big switch in the 1960s that simply did not happen? It didn't take place. It wasn't a thing. But you see this now, today, in America. That's why West Virginia used to be a completely blue state. Today it's 71%, I think, voted for Donald Trump in the last election. Overwhelmingly Republican. And their values. Again, the values of family, community, God, the military, lower taxes, patriotism. All those values are very important to these people. And they're not on board with, again, the way that, let's say, some Northern Democrats have taken the party, which is completely straight to communism. They're not going to go for that. It's going to make them change. But again, it took place after this entire revelation, much further, about 30 years. So keep that in mind when people tell you this lie about the big switch. Didn't happen. So anyone who tells you that, you can laugh at them and, play them this clip from my show. That way they'll figure out what the hell's going on. All right. And don't tell me your college professor told you about it. I could care less. I'll debate him any day of the week. Let me go back to what I was talking about yesterday, though. I kind of got cut off at the end. I was being very bloviated when I was talking about the history of slavery in our country. And again, this is another kind of green show moment where you can go back and listen to this time and time again. Because these are the facts. So, lately, and again, we've heard this starting to come back up. We're told that, whites are the, benefactors of this great nation that was created by the work on slaves, of course. And if it wasn't for those damn Europeans, blacks would, I guess, prospered in Africa or what have you. And this is what we're told time and time again. You hear Joyless Reed talk about this. You hear the ignoramuses of The View talk about this. It's just nonstop. CNN's talking about this now all of a sudden. You have some of these dunces come up with these moronic books like White Fragility or, what's his name? Michael Eric Dyson, who's a complete schmuck, by the way. Complete idiot. Writing these books, simply on race. They have no idea what they're talking about. In every sense of the word. They're clueless. They're repeating college talking point lies. That's all there is. That's really all that's happening. So, even CNN did this little program on slavery recently. And it's just idiotic. That's all it is. It's idiotic to do this. They don't tell you the truth about slavery in this nation because they don't want you to know the truth. That's why they have things, say, like critical race theory. They do all these things to, again, try to divide people, not bring people together. Now, I think everybody listening to the show would agree that slavery is an awful institution, and it is. But what they don't tell you, again, is that at the time that this nation was formed, and when it was even founded in 1492, slavery was a universal institution. In every single continent, every single civilization, this was the norm. Now, it's awful to say that, but this is the God's honest truth. This was the norm. There wasn't anything unique to Europeans or one group of people or one race or one religion. This is the truth about it. CNN attacks on, again, white Americans, that slavery was just, a matter of this distant past. And it was made for amends for our responsibility in the Civil War. A bunch of nonsense. The reason why, again, there were black slaves in America, and by the way, there were slaves of every race in this country. Don't let them fool you on that one either. Just go ask the Irish how it was for them. Go ask the Chinese how it was for them. Every single race had some form of slavery in the United States. Maybe not to the same magnitude, but it was just an institution. And every single race owned slaves. Yes, blacks, Asians also owned slaves. Understand that. And by the way, Indians owned slaves as well. You know, we look to come out and think, oh yeah, they were just peacefully assembled. All of a sudden we just came in and we just started killing everybody. There is some truth to that. But nobody goes over the basic that these Indian tribes would go to war with one another. They didn't enslave the men and women and children. They didn't kill. They take their land, their resources, their money, their wealth. And they even genocide certain other Indian tribes in the Americas. Nobody talks about that, though. Nobody says anything about it. But again, this is the reality of the situation. You had other Indians wiping out other Indian tribes. So again, these ideas that, again, this is simply unique to whites, and whites hold the brunt for slavery in the world, it's preposterous. It holds no water for anyone that actually studies the situation. One other thing that's important, before I move on for the rest of this article by Paul Craig Roberts, it's brilliantly written. I hope all of you can go and read it perhaps afterwards. You still have slavery in certain parts of the world today. I know we like to think that slavery is eradicated, we were the last ones that had it, and this and that. In Africa today, there are about 18 or 19, I forget what it is, different countries where you can buy another human being. Straight up, you can buy another human being. Parts of Asia, same thing. You can also talk about indentured servitude. You have over 2 million Uyghur Muslims in China, in Western China, right? Living in internment camps, in concentration camps, work camps. That's a form of slavery, is it not? So when we think about the United States, when we think about white European culture, that they love to tell you exactly what you did, but they won't talk about what anybody else did or what is happening today. They won't tell you that the UK was one of the first nations to ban slavery. They won't tell you that. They won't tell you that the reason why the white Europeans, who were trying to develop, largely in the agrarian South, as I just mentioned to you in my last piece, they found the slave market in this kingdom called Dahomey, or Dahomey, excuse me. Or is it Dahomey? I think it's Dahomey, actually. Dahomey. Not Dahomey. Hey, yeah. It's called the Kingdom of Dahomey. And what happened was simply this. This is where the market was. The same thing happened in this kingdom that happened, as I said to you, with the Indians, what happened with, every other civilization on Earth. The Kingdom of Dahomey would go to war with the neighboring tribes or kingdoms or civilizations. They would win. Okay, and then what would happen? Well, we have the New World forming in the Caribbeans, North, South America. You have the European colonists finding the, abundant resources, but no people to cultivate the land. So the British, who brought the slaves again into parts of North America, where we are today. You have other European sea captains seeing this business opportunity of purchasing slaves from the Kingdom of Dahomey, from this king that ran this civilization, selling them to the colonists as a labor force. And again, the king of Dahomey, I keep saying Dahomey, excuse me, that's how it is, Dahomey, conducted this annual slave wars, right, against other blacks. He sold the surplus to the Arabs, largely, by the way. More slaves are brought into the Arab slave trade than the North Atlantic slave trade. That's a fact, too, by the way. But no white colonists in what later became the United States ever enslaved a black person on their own. They were already purchased as slaves because they were already enslaved by the king of Dahomey. This is a fact. There were already slaves in Africa. Now, what you read in your textbook when you were growing up, it probably said, whites went to Africa, they got slaves, and they brought them to the New World in harsh conditions, which again were true. But they don't tell you the other important part. That these blacks were already enslaved, they've already lost their land. They were slaves already in Africa, and they were sold by other blacks to whoever came to get them, really. Arabs, whites, other blacks, didn't matter. This was the institution at the time. So now we have the United States coming into great existence in the late 18th century. Slavery was already an inherited institution at the time because that's how the British formed the colonies, of course. Slavery existed as this labor force, again, on these large agricultural plantations, by and large. The agribusinesses of the time. And again, the plantations using slave labor did not enslave the slaves. They were already purchased as slaves in this kingdom of Dahomey. Okay? That's a fact. Take that to the bank with you. Cash it. So now we have in the United States, we have slavery. Again, being committed in the United States. We formed the nation. There was slavery already happening. And slavery, again, was not unique to just one race of people owning another race. It was simply everybody. So slavery had this long life in the United States because white immigrants who entered the Americas, largely our nation, could avoid becoming agricultural labor by moving west. Think about California, occupying new land to which the Native Americans had use rights, but not ownership rights as understood in Western law. So we need to talk about that too, because that's another point that nobody talks about. You have the Mexican-American War, right? 1846 to 1848. A long time ago. America wins. Okay? They signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. We even give them money for half of Mexico. It was signed into law. This is your land. You have purchased this from us. Every single Mexican citizen that was living in this entire region, by the way, Texas, you have, think Arizona, think New Mexico, California, which became a state at that time, parts of Oregon, of course, and we have other territories. In that entire vast region of the Midwest, well, extending past the Midwest, but Western United States, only 100,000 people lived in that region, the entire region. Most of them being Native Indians. So this big lie that the United States kicked the Mexicans out and stole their land, simply not true. Anyone of Mexican citizenry was instantly granted American citizenship. This has never happened before. Nobody was kicked off their land. It's a bunch of nonsense. And again, I'll just implore you again to think about, you had 100,000 people living in this massive space. That is not a lot of people. And again, most of them were Native Indians, just living on this terrain. So nobody was kicked off their land. Nobody had their rights taken away. They became instant American citizens. That's a fact. So whenever they get on there and say, this is stolen land, really? Your government agreed to it. In fact, the United States could have taken all of Mexico if they wanted to. But they decided to take just half. That's what they decided upon. And they even paid the Mexican government, I think, $15 million at the time, if I'm not mistaken. So the lies, nobody's illegal on stolen land. You see this, phrase all the time today. And again, stupidity. They don't know anything about what they're talking about. There were barely any Mexicans even on this land. Barely. They make it sound like it looks like as if it does today, where there's large Latin populations throughout the American Southwest. It wasn't like that. It really wasn't. So keep that in mind when you're, again, being told these things by people. It's completely stupid. But going back to slavery now. going back to slavery. Slavery is this expensive force for labor, yes? Right? So in the 18th century America, that'd be the 1800s, you had to have money in order to have slaves. You couldn't be a broke farmer, as so many Confederate soldiers were, just so we're all clear on that, by the way. That's another big myth. The Civil War was fought over slavery. Big lie. So if you had your average male field hand, that would cost you about $1,500 for housing, for medical care, food, all this stuff, if you want that person to be productive. If that person was a blacksmith or carpenter, even more skilled, that would cost you $2,000. So the idea that, these, again, largely agrarian, that these farmers were simply buying these slaves and housing them, simply not true. Simply not true. Nobody in the South, with the exception of very few people, had the money to purchase this many slaves and, again, maintain that. So please don't tell me that, all these people signed up in the war to, preserve slavery, which, again, really wasn't about. So, that brings us to where we are today, in many regards, with the Civil War. Now, we certainly know that Uncle Tom's Cabin, right, that propagandist book, we know that simply just isn't true. We know that, for example, Lincoln's War, this Emancipation Proclamation, had zero response, right? We're always told, Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. No. All it was an executive measure signed by Lincoln in 1863 during the war, and it was a war measure that Lincoln hoped would produce a slave rebellion. So what it meant was if the North came upon slaves, those slaves were to be set free, and they were hoping that there would be this type of slave rebellion. It wasn't just this act that freed all the slaves. And again, they were hoping it would drain Robert E. Lee's Army of the Northern Virginia of troops who would rush home to defend their women and children. But nothing like that happened. So in other words, the blacks that fought with the South, right, apparently this war for slavery, I mean, imagine hearing that. They thought that was going to create a rebellion. They'd go back. They'd free everybody, their women and children. Nothing of this sort happened, though. Never materialized. And no Southern troops left the lines. The enslaved blacks were protective, really, of the otherwise unprotected white women and children. They didn't revolt. Again, because it didn't stem from the idea of racism that we see later in this country on a Southern plantation. Many of these plantation overseers were black slaves themselves. So we hear these things. We hear that the war was fought over slavery. That is a big lie. Both sides understood that the issue in this war was economical. It was about tariffs. It was about taxation. It was not about slavery, as you're previously told in high school and college and wherever else. Through CNN, I guess. I don't know where else you'd get your information. So we have the southern states now that wanted to secede when Lincoln was elected on constitutional grounds. And that way that there was no rebellion of any sort. They were done. They didn't want to be part of the United States because they knew that the moral tariff was going to be coming to them. And just so we're clear on this, the South's ports, right, on the East Coast, they were largely a tariff-free or low-tariff zone versus what the North was doing. So now the South realized, okay, these states have seceded from the Union. They've created their own independent nation now called the Confederacy. And the idea was, how are they going to compete now in this area where there's little or no tariffs? Why would they want to keep passing their goods in northern ports if the southern ports are free to do business? Essentially, free trade. So now we have Lincoln repeatedly saying that the war against the rebels was to collect the tariff. And yes, they were rebels. They seceded, right? But it was not to abolish slavery. And I'll implore all of you, go look up the Morrill Tariff. It was passed 2 days before Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861, and it imposed a tariff of 47% and established a policy of high protectionism in American industry that would last for decades. So in other words, they were like, okay, you guys are paying this much now. You're not going to be, having a free open port. You're going to start paying a lot more money to the federal government. They refused. Now, this same Congress that passed this into law, without the South, by the way, also passed a guarantee to the South that if they stayed in the Union and paid the tariff, the U.S. government would guarantee the existence of slavery in perpetuity. It was called the Corwin Amendment. They would put it on the Constitution that slavery could not be abolished, even by constitutional amendment. And Lincoln even endorsed this. Now, a lot of you are saying, well, Drace, you told us earlier the Republican Party was the party of anti-slavery, right? It was, they wanted to abolish slavery. That's true. but this does not flow with what they believed in. This is how they thought they would get the South to come back and join the nation. It didn't work. For the southern states, the tariff was the issue. It was the economy. So they didn't take up Lincoln and his offer to pay this massive tariff in exchange for the protection of slavery, which, again, was being phased out. The Industrial Revolution was beginning at this time. You are, again, starting to see people, again, slowly starting to move away from basic agrarianism. The slavery explanation of the war was, again, invented by these dishonest Northern historians who wanted to cover up the Union crimes by giving it this way of moral justification. They had to go in and free the slaves this way. This is the only way it could have been done. Simply wasn't true. Simply wasn't true. So when you hear about these things, you hear about, this is, black versus white, North versus South, slavery. They never tell you it's about the tariffs or the economy, which is absolutely 100% what it was. And they are doing a big disservice when they do this. By the way, again, I told you this. There were blacks that literally fought in the Confederacy and stayed with the Confederacy the entire time. One other point of great interest, by the way. On the seacoast of the country once known as Dahomey, I think it's in modern Benin now, there is a memorial to the black slaves sold into the New World by the Black King of Dahomey. It consists of an arch symbolizing the passage of hundreds of thousands of captives from Dahomey's slaves into slavery abroad. Are you ever told this? Has anyone ever told this on CNN, MSNBC, NBC, CBS, PBS, the New York Crimes, the Washington Post? Anyone tell you this? Do you think they ever studied this in black studies, African American studies? Nobody tells you this. I tell you this because I go through the facts. This is the truth of the matter, folks. But this is perfect for what they use it for. White versus black. Slaves versus non-slaves. Whites were exploiting blacks. This is how they use all these things. To, again, tear you apart. To make people angry. This is how they do it. This is how they do it. And again, we see the after effects of this now. After a result of the civil rights movement, we have things like affirmative action, which is this policy of restricting access of qualified whites to university admissions, to employment, promotion. And they use it so they can get so-called people of color in these positions. I think it was the president of either United or Delta not too long ago. They want half of their pilots to be people of color. Why would that be a requirement if we're supposed to be living in a color-blind society based on merit? Why would that be an issue to you? But again, we see many qualified white men being prevented from obtaining the benefit of, let's say, the Ivy League network, so they can hand it to somebody else. Denied jobs, denied promotions, so that other races can advance. This, in and of itself, number one, it violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It also violates the 14th Amendment. Now we're seeing it in other ways. We're seeing it in the issue of DEI in this country. Discrimination against merit. Biden loved that policy, didn't he? When he was slightly awake. Corporations joining, you saw this. Gillette, Bud Light, you see the NFL, all these things. Starbucks, there's another place you should never go, Starbucks. Ugh. You see it on Netflix with these awful movies, you see it in these Disney movies. You saw Snoop Dogg the other day talking about how he can't believe that he had to explain to his young grandkid that, I don't know, I forget what it even was. But a guy could give birth. I forget what it was. It's something ridiculous. I try not to pay attention to this. It gets me upset. I can't take much more of this anymore. But again, now these institutions are working against a certain race of people. Where's the 14th Amendment? Where's equal protection under the law for everybody, regardless of their race? Then we have things like affirmative action. We had Biden. I remember this too. Biden going out there and saying, we're only going to give aid to black farmers. I said, what? Are you kidding me? How is this even something that could be passed through? This is absolutely discrimination. And you don't do discrimination of one group to make it right for another group for something that happened 150 something years ago. You don't make things right from segregation by, again, not allowing people of a certain race, whites, Asians, Jews, from entering a university. We need to get back to a merit-based system. And again, this idea of reparations, they want reparations? Okay. Go tell the progeny of the king of Dahomey to write you a check, please. Write you a check for that, I guess. I don't know. You have people that were never slaves begging for reparations for slavery, of which they never were, by people who never owned slaves. And by the way, one last point. I said this a little earlier. I alluded to the fact. Your average Confederate soldier in the war were mostly poor farmers. They didn't have the means to own a slave. And do you think they're going to go to war to protect the small group of people that own slaves? Are you kidding me? So when they start taking down, these Democrat statues, Robert E. Lee's, this and that, just know they're taking down history and the situation. It was not to preserve slavery, as they would like you to think, but it was about states' rights, which was a very important thing at the time, and it really should be today. And it was fought over the economy, the moral tariff, taxation. That's what it was fought over. It wasn't fought over slavery, although that was the end result of the war, as we later would see with the 13th Amendment. So, knowing all that, I have nothing more to say on this. Just the fact that you've been lied to many, many times in the past. You'll probably be lied to many, many, many more times in the future. And again, that's why you listen to my show, because I'm the one that tells you exactly how it is. Folks, thanks you for being here. Again, play this for some of your friends that have no idea what the hell's going on in American history. I like doing these shows sometimes where I give you the exact facts. And those are all facts. You can look all this up. It's all true. You can read it anywhere if you go look for it. Folks, thanks for being here. I appreciate you. I will be here with you tomorrow for another episode of The Marco Dre Show. Until then, make sure you're you're just keeping your house in order, storing up your food, water, ammo, anything to be self-sufficient. And I will see you next time. Until then, be good, stay busy, and God bless.